Before we open it to the group, I mean, just to, because this, the speakers of this day got merged into the plenary session, so we have just a few questions, I think, for some of the speakers of the day, and then also to remind you to make sure that when we open to the floor that you acknowledge today's speakers who did not have their own subsection. I would like to start by asking Vali, actually, to speak a little bit more, because, well, you talked about the archaeology of the final decade as being an ambiguous title, and it is, but obviously the reference that one can think of, especially given the subject matter that you introduced today, is of course the last decade of the Shah's rule in Iran. So in that sense, it would be interesting to, if you can bring up a little bit the political and ideological context in which the Shiraz festival was conceived, and we're particularly interested, well, to be a bit curatorially self-referential, because for us it was interesting to connect you and Pio's work, because there is a strange, or, well, not so strange, uncanny, but otherwise predictable similarity between the hybridity of the Marcos regime and the hybridity of the Shah regime, both of them navigating between this ultra-contemporary sort of feeding into the American alliance and nativist, pacifist fantasies at the same time. So that kind of hybridity is shared among these two countries. So Pio spoke very much about that context, but I would encourage you to do so as well.
Okay. Thanks, Cosmin. Yes, in the answer to the first question, the original title does relate to thinking about the critical shifts, the real shifts that happened between the 70s and the 80s in Iran. But more recent projects, a project I'm doing now is looking at Raqqa in Syria and the museum in Raqqa that's disappeared, and the objects in it have all gone. We don't know if they've been completely destroyed or some of them have been just looted. And there's enough material to reconstruct some of the objects. And there's a project at Leiden University that's heavily working on this and collecting these documents to see if they can actually reproduce some of the objects, or at least deliver the material, the information to Interpol so that they could be stopped if they appear in the open market. And I'm doing a project in Lebanon, so it's not just about Iran, but it did start there. The second question about the regimes. I've kept away from the sort of state narratives very deliberately, because at least in the case of the Festival of Art Shiraz Persepolis, there were a group of very emancipated and very radical Iranian intellectuals who set up the festival, which sets the whole thing apart intellectually and in terms of his political drive and in terms of his aesthetic qualities from anything that's top-down in that sense. Also, in the case of Iran, there was a kind of government within the government and strands that didn't work with each other very well. So the Festival of Art Shiraz Persepolis was sponsored by the radio and television. I live in England, so that would be let's say, the equivalent of BBC. The Ministry of Culture was not happy with the ideas and the genealogies of that festival. The Ministry of Culture was much more heavily controlled by the intelligence services, by the secret services, and the Festival of Arts was a temporary space for 11 or 12 days once a year, and because it had patronage from the Queen, it was allowed to operate pretty much as a kind of free autonomous zone for those days. So its budget came not from the Ministry of Culture. The control did not get imposed on it from the usual sources. And it operated also on some very abstract levels where performances were not scripted, they were site-specific, they were inviting people from all over the world, etc. So in terms of connection to regime, I've never been that interested in it. As you saw, I've kind of used it as a starting point to look at those kind of euphoric and utopian and transcendental networks and ideas that existed in the world at the time. And I'm not sure, I mean, I did look at the Philippines at a certain time. I couldn't find enough information on it. But going the other way to Baalbek in Lebanon, which actually was a festival. It started in the 50s, much earlier than Shiraz. And Shiraz was inspired partly by Baalbek. But when you look at those archives, you see that they are very safe, very contained, a very nice bourgeois project, lots of Margot Fontaine and Royal Shakespeare companies and that sort of thing. Whereas at Shiraz, within the very first few years, it makes a very radical shift towards the global south. And it really sustains that for a very long period. So I think maybe each of them are quite different. There was another festival in Carthage in Tunisia, which was also now not known at all, but quite active, also earlier than Shiraz. So this sort of Shiraz or Carthage, Baalbek Shiraz was a kind of a romantic moment, but I think each of them would have had quite a different series of drives behind them.
But if I may press on a little bit, because, well, also like curious, like who was responsible for that? So, I mean, if you think that this is not actually really circumscribed in any wider ideological or sort of like strategic framework by the state, who were the sort of like driving curators or, you know, who had the vision behind such a visionary festival?
I mean, that is a great question. I haven't even been bringing those names into the project just because I'm not that interested in personalities, so to speak, and that's just my sort of philosophical position on the projects I do. However, the three main people originally, Reza Qutbi, Khojaste Kia, and Farrokh Ghaffari, three cultured Iranian intellectuals. One was the first director of the Iranian radio and television. The other was a playwright and a theater practitioner and a director, a lady who was trained at the Old Vic in the UK, and the third one used to work at the Cinematheque in Paris, and he was a filmmaker himself. So this kind of initial committee then had a bigger branch of people helping them, and over the years there were many, many other theater practitioners and writers, playwrights, etc., who got involved in different committees organizing the festival. So I think it's very reductive and also kind of not giving the space to those artists and the filmmakers who were really responsible for this thing to think that there was some kind of a oil money and a king and some kind of megalomania that kind of drove the whole thing, because that actually was the narrative that was thrown at the festival. Partly by internal forces, because the intelligence services of the regime itself found the space of the festival very subversive. They used to call it a play of fire, they used to call it a cesspit of communists, etc. They would pay the local critics to write really badly about the festival. So it's very complicated, and then there's a queen who's a patron of it. So it's a very complicated space of negotiations. And the Stalinist communists also didn't like the festival. It was contested from the beginning because of all these complications, because anything that was done in the desert, under the galaxies, transcendental, prancing around, was basically wasting time, unless you were going to be explicitly anti-imperialist and or performing for the workers in the factories or performing the rights of peasants, then you were doing art for art's sake, which was really not the right thing to be doing at that time. So they did boycott it at the same time, and in that dogma, they failed to see the third worldist sort of non-aligned movement spirit. and the kind of mobilizing the global south and this solidarity sensibility within the festival, which is one of those blind spots within blind spots that they didn't manage to see that. So in the end, what happened was that Khomeini rose and chose this already contested space back in 1977, a full year before anything had erupted in Iran, as a wonderful opportunity to pounce on and to declare a religious decree against it on the 28th of September 77. I mean, the revolution came to power in 79 and already called it decadent and un-Islamic, etc., etc. So the myth that stayed later, combination of the sort of very hard left dogmatic, the Iranian intelligence services, and then the Islamist decree, turned this whole thing into some kind of frozen object, which ended up being called a West-toxicated project of an imperial court that wanted to show off to the world that they were cultured. So that's where the myth gets then stuck. And by retrieving the material and look at the material, you realize that the narrative is much more complex than that. And the material that's been frozen away is actually a part of global history. And in some ways, this festival is the longest running festival of its kind that managed to successfully put those dialogues and networks on an equal stage. So it's extremely important as a sort of segment of international history, which would otherwise be lost. And actually, interestingly enough, in Naeem's recent work about the non-aligned movement, I realized that really Islamism takes over in so many places from the spirit of the non-aligned movement. And this is exactly what happens here at the festival, because in the end, a decree, religious decree, calls something which is really in the spirit of the non-aligned movement as decadent. So I don't know what else I can say, but that's already too much, I think.
No, this perfectly answers the question. Thank you very much. Well, I was anyhow planning to instigate the Filipinos after this, but Marianne started herself. So both Marianne and well.
All right. I'll pick up a few words. We've had a conversation. We've had running conversations with Bali, actually. Immediately, we knew that we had conversations for a long time, even if we hadn't met. I'll pick up a few words. Reduction, narrative. The key, I think, to moving forward is really the hope that we do not slip into reduction. That is absolutely necessary because there are dots that really need to be connected. I'll give you some dots. Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, Pinochet, the Shah, Hassan of Morocco, Nicaragua, Somoza. These are connected dots. I grew up to shift into a personal narrative. I grew up in, not grew up, but I began my life in art under Imelda Marcos's Cultural Center, where I actually saw the traffic of international artists. I met Nureyev, I met Fontaine, I met Xenakis, I met the people that were in Shiraz. I had a wonderful conversation about perhaps 20 years ago with Hossein Valamanesh from Iran, and we essentially had the same experience, him in Iran and myself in Manila. Of course, Imelda Marcos wanted to be Empress Farah and decided to clothe herself that way, including the sash. Now, the Shiraz Festival, she also wanted to emulate. And she, in fact, did so in a, this is the part where you cannot reduce things to just connecting dots. Because when she staged her Kasaysayan ng Lahi, the narrative of our race, she did copy the procession of the parade of tribes that consisted the nation. This is a direct copy of what happened during that one big party. However, in Iran. And the important thing to realize is that the Philippines, under Marcos, while this was going on, was also, number one, wanting to invade Sabah, and did, and incited the first reaction from Kuala Lumpur, because Tunku Abdul Rahman decided that, Mr. Marcos didn't think, because he was such an American, did not think that Malaysia was going to react. But Malaysia did react, and hence we've had a 50-year set of difficulties in the South, to begin with. The other thing that did not happen is that Bandung did not happen for the Philippines at all. So the shift to the non-aligned did not happen. Marcos in Manila, it's almost like a hall of mirrors where it looks like the same things were happening, the same people were going around, but it's not the same. Because the Marcosian tangent was to simply not be part of the non-aligned movement. We did not shift south. While I was introduced into what was called the avant-garde at the Cultural Center that was built in emulation of Faradiba. So these are dots that we need to connect, including Chile under Pinochet.
But also too, because Pio directly talked today about this, the complicated legacy of conceptual figures, and especially because you mentioned Chile, and if we think of a sort of a genealogy of the present, in Chile, all the references of contemporary art and of the critical scene were in exile or killed, were firmly opposed to the Pinochet regime, where in the Philippines there was obviously a more complicated relationship with power in that sense, and than the kind of like Chilean case. So
I think just elaborate on what Marianne said, like this kind of consonance between Iran and Manila wasn't actually coincidental. I don't think she kind of fleshed it out, but Imelda Marcos went to this sort of the 250,000th birthday party of the empire, and there's actually and she ended up sharing a tent with Christina Ford. So this kind of weird marriage of kind of Fordism in a tent with Marcosian culture. And there's this incredible YouTube clip where she kind of casts herself as a kind of protagonist in this pageant. But I mean, going back to this idea of reduction, I think what drives my research, one of the things that drives my research is the frustration that there is a kind of inadequacy in connecting these dots. But I'm speaking more about dots of particular practitioners who kind of enabled the CCP and the avant-garde in Manila. So there are certain people who occupy certain research territories in Manila. So there's a researcher on Tibet. Patrick Flores writes a lot about Raimundo Albano, and kind of notes that the only voice of dissent at the birth of the CCP was David Medalla. But there still needs to be a lot of synthesizing that needs to happen, because actually the positions they all occupied was very complex, and that hasn't really happened yet. And I mean, I'd hope I can contribute somehow to that, but that's a conversation that a lot of actors that are currently active right now in Manila need to have.
I want to say something, actually. I'm kind of less interested in the actors in that sense, and also the state policies. I'm much more interested in, I got much more excited to understand the very intimate networks, cyclical, going around backwards and forwards between these different places, and these very, very serious engagements between a certain level of thinkers and artists from different places, maybe somebody in India speaking to somebody in Senegal who's speaking via France to somebody in Poland. That was really the excitement. Not at all the institutional side of it. That's why I've hardly ever spoken about the institutional side of any of the stuff that I've done, because that, to me, was a revelation. So I wanted to harness that excitement and that force, because that's the real force.
Could I just say one sentence? Just a sentence. Jose Maceda and Xenakis actually met at that time, and that was the kind of conversation you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
So to sort of keep it in like kind of the same decade, and you know, and the same sort of like melancholy of an archaeology of a final decade of sorts, taking lots of licenses here. But I wanted to ask Tina, who was also not in her respective plenary session, a complicated question about popular culture or a particular moment in the popular culture of Hong Kong, and it was prominently featured in your exhibition. And as well, everyone in Hong Kong knows, and maybe some of our guests as well, there is this narrative of a golden age of Cantopop, of Cantonese-speaking films and popular culture, which was it was also like the first Pan-Asian popular culture, so that created a sort of a Pan-Asian identity on one hand, because it was the first time that it wasn't a Western product that was able to circulate between borders, but it also, very importantly, created an identity for Hong Kong. And there's very few other places, territories that are so fundamentally defined by popular culture rather than by high culture or other forms of engineering. And the reverse of that is that there's also the perception that this is somehow fading, dying, and it's being replaced by something else. Both by, well, it's obviously that's discussed in the context of the growing influence of China, but there's also a very interesting narrative, which I'm curious, how do you deal with that at M+, that is obviously like bridging both art and popular culture, because another narrative in Hong Kong is that contemporary art is now replacing popular culture as the sort of like height of cultural production of the city.
Well, it's a very complex question in a way. I think, I mean, the second part is about institutionally how we handle. I mean, it's a little bit difficult to talk about high culture, low culture, but I guess that's fundamentally the crux of that question. I'd like to talk a little bit about the first part. Yes, I think Cantonese popular culture, Cantonese language popular culture did come to define Hong Kong, but it's also, I think I wasn't able to talk, sorry, I'm still a bit ill, so much about the kind of diaspora, because I think this, I mean, you can probably all tell, I grew up in England, in a Cantonese family. I grew up in Bristol, was present for the riots, but, you know, I didn't grow up in a very Cantonese family, but my link to Cantonese culture was through popular culture, through film, and to some extent through music. But that extended much beyond kind of Cantonese cultural sphere. I mean, it also reached, I studied in Beijing, and there were people that were listening to Cantonese popular music in order to learn Cantonese. So there is an identity element there. I think the transnational nature of that was possibly, I think that's the role of M+, is to dig a little bit more deeply into, as an institution, I think we are a little bit limited in the sense that we are looking at popular culture through the lens of visual culture, but to look at why it had that impact. I mean, what were the elements of it that made it so kind of exciting and to have such a kind of grip and to have such an international appeal. I think for, this question of Hong Kong popular culture and identity is also linked to circulation and modes of circulation and funding and to the economics. I touched upon that a little bit in my talk about the economics of the entertainment industry. That's possibly not something that I feel so comfortable talking about. It's not, it's a little bit beyond my knowledge. But for sure, I think this sort of shift from certain modes of kind of reception and consumption of popular culture, it's dramatically shifted. And I think that definitely plays into the kind of, the centrality of popular culture as a particular kind of identity marker. Yeah.
Well, since we're in the subject of pop culture, just to move to Xiaoshuan's and Bowan's presentation, which was great, and you brought pop culture and entertainment in the post-Canto pop moment, which is now the K-pop moment, which is now the new reference across Asia of beauty, entertainment, and mass media, and how it's also, I guess, speaking of the differences of context, the hyper-capitalization of every single minute, second of representation, where the movie stars make more money in advertising this very controversial and politically charged bottle of water. Our question was more related in a pragmatic sense. It's more, what is all this research that you're doing going to become? Is it something that you're, because the film that we saw is your own filming, right? And I'm thinking those architectural drawings is from your work, no? What are you doing? What will we see next year?
Yeah, so basically, I think we try to cut parts from our adventure this summer and into something that we feel as related with the topic of heritage. But in general, actually we don't know. But there are more materials and in artifacts also experiences, memories. We're planning to compile afterwards, because. We actually made a trip also to North Korea. Maybe I can share the story, because we entered North Korea, Rasen, with some Chinese traders who I made friends with, and it was a very strange moment, because we entered North Korea the day right after Trump and Kim Jong-un met in Singapore. So when we entered the border, and one of the immigration officers asked us, "Have you ever been to Singapore?" And so at that moment, we didn't know, they should not know, the summit happened. So the news was released in North Korea 2 days after, which we also witnessed how people reacted to this moment when they hear about this meeting between Kim Jong-un and Trump. But anyway, so there's lots of memories, especially in North Korea, because there are places we could not make any photos. But I feel very fortunate we have Xiaoshuan with me this time. She drew all the interior spaces through our trip in North Korea, including some very private dinners with North Korean officials. And so lots of memories try to also imaginary, maybe it's already fictional, and to compile together. So maybe film, maybe some other format of the experience. So.
Yeah, so the project we presented today, I'm just speaking for myself, is part of a larger project that is looking at China's inner Asian frontiers. So my own PhD research was looking at the Xinjiang-Kazakhstan border. maybe I shouldn't talk about it now. And then my own teaching at Hong Kong U, I took undergrad students to the northern part of Laos, and the studio is looking at the China-Lao Railway project. Maybe I shouldn't talk about here as well. But most of the project I'm looking at now, I think the starting point was, as a Chinese, I'm always challenged by so many people. They will keep asking me about Xinjiang, about Tibet, about like what China is doing in the other countries. I think the starting point was I want to understand more about my culture, my countries, and how should I position myself as a Chinese. And then I feel like as a designer, I started as an architect, and then I started landscape architect, and then I studied like human geography and historical geography. I feel like the two or the skill I learned can help me to tell some stories that can hardly be covered either by the verbal description or in the typical image. So I start to redraw the space I experience. So that started from my project in Xinjiang and later on in Tumen and northern Laos. And sometimes how there's certain information I took out on purpose when I show to a particular audience. And in another case, maybe I will start to add in more information in my drawing. So I feel like the drawing or the representation of the space allows me to find the freedom to talk about how I see these spaces. I'm not representing my country. I'm more talking about my own experience. I feel like those drawings or these collaborations with filmmakers, Bo, or sometimes with other artists in different cases allowed us to talk about something that is code sensitive in majority of the cases. So in terms of how we want these works to be shown, I think each time, if this is for an exhibition, it depends on where the exhibition is. I will reframe it for the mainland Chinese context. I will reframe it for exhibition in the other part of the world. So I feel like that's a very interesting question because I think the format of the exhibition or the output itself is part of the design or is part of the project. So we're actually working on, we're preparing for another conference for next year, Royal Geography Association's annual conference in London in next summer. So we'll be showing some of the drawings as well as a video clips in London. So we're talking about what we'll be showing there. And then we're also invited by some universities in mainland China. And of course, in that case, I'll be thinking about how we're going to tell the story in that particular location or within that particular context. Because I don't know, yeah. So we don't know the exact format yet, but it will be exhibition, will be different versions of the videos being shown in different parts of the world.
Yeah. So how do you think you'll tell the story there, or like how do you maybe?
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, because also like this project really, it's about the different kind of in this region that has different sort of a history, different kind of narrative based on myths, based on like understanding of the geography. And we are looking out for different possibilities to show, maybe it's an exhibition, maybe it's a film in different countries. Maybe we need to tailor a little bit towards different opportunities, but then also there's some potential opportunities to show the film, which I think we should not talk about at this moment. No. Yeah, so anyway, so I think it's still a project in the very early stage. We were thinking about where this could be going.
Yes, we're gonna just be more direct to Lawrence and Natasha, and then, I mean, it already became more porous, so please, or whoever wants to react after this questions that we have. Yes. Yes, for Natasha, I think that maybe this was just perhaps a coincidence, but as I was hearing it, the riots bring, or the riots that she talked about, or that the artist's work were addressing, had experiences of destruction, no? And in various cases of disappearing populations through genocide or forced disappearance or a very systematized violence, no? So I was thinking that you said very directly on how, if we think of heritage, let's think of the bodies of individuals, no? Like if the individual is embodied, no, with the ancestry and with the tradition, and if those are killed or disappeared, well, eventually it really disappears, no? Or it's in danger. And yeah, I don't know if you want to expand a little bit on that.
Okay. Yeah, I think I was also trying very much, at least in this, say, chapter of this project, because we are kind of working towards a publication and trying to think about how to keep growing, as y'all were talking about, sort of keep having a sustained way of contextualizing such case studies and artistic practice that respond very specifically to that geography, but also to certain kinds of histories of violence and of communalism, and at the same time of the emancipatory potential of uprising, as I was sort of indicating. I just feel at this point that it feels productive to look at this span of the 60s to 80s, also just in terms of the kind of governance systems that we are facing, and try and imagine a kind of future horizon in which riots and rebellion will become more a kind of a common feature, and to then think what our, how not to perhaps become weaponized as a society, but at the same time, how to ensure that the kind of the wave of communal hate, etc., doesn't entirely take over and consume us. So what is the border, right, between that individual body of the rioting subject and the kind of governance system that actually can bury itself or hide itself inside the crowd and manipulate the crowd? Because now the future that we're also talking about is the algorithmic mob, because there are a lot of riots that spread through rumor. So this is also the case, that's why social media is, is sort of so tightly controlled. So I'm now just sharing the various potentialities of the project, but it really came from these starting points, and now we'll have to see where it goes. Yeah.
Yes, and to Lawrence. I'm going to shift maybe a bit the conversation, because I think that definitely, and I guess people experience the piece that he created live for us. It's definitely, I think he's developed an art form which is clearly quite unique, and that has different layers in the room through the echoes of sound, and there's something in the craft that it sounds a bit formalist, but I'm a
formalist, it's okay.
No. My question is going to sound formalist. But it's more like, I think I'm curious on how, when you're doing this work with real people who you've interviewed, do you continue to find sounds that you still associate to those cases? Like, how do you, it feels like it's like this, I don't know, when you said at the beginning, linking it to Marianne's paper about the importance of indexing and cataloging. And I think throughout the exhibitions, throughout the talks today, we saw actually the importance to create nomenclature and like creating that data stimulates like depth and fact, and it brings us somehow closer to truth in a way. So, but with sound, as you said, it's like there's still no vocabulary. It's like you use the sound effects that are in a mass media catalog, but it seems that it can still be an open space. I'm just curious on your own way of working. Like I guess you have, I don't know, this sensibility to still hearing things that we don't hear.
No, I don't think it's like that. I think it's more just a sort of conceptual focus. I don't think it's. I don't have better ears than anyone. I also messed up my ears big time with music when I was younger, so probably I have the worst hearing. But the point is that it's not really about hearing, right? Or the capacities to actually hear. It's about forms of listening, ways that, because as I've said before and many times, and if you've heard me say it before, I'm sorry, but the interest in sound is not about sound. I think what sound teaches you is that it teaches about leakage. And in this, and it shows you that everything exists in a kind of relational state. So sound is a good way to sort of evaluate leakage across things. So in this case, there was plenty of leakage between sight and sound, through walls, but also through the sort of architecture of memory, you know, and the way that also kind of functions and filters and produces its own effect. So I think this is what I tried to say, that there's sort of two parts to that inventory. On the one hand, it's really specific cases that demand some kind of reenactment, right? So, and I didn't talk about them, but let's say the car door instrument. The car door instrument is built with a resonant wood body, which means that it simulates, how I designed it, simulates being in a trunk of a car if you listen from one specific angle and you hear the door. And what I was interested in that then is to understand, okay, there was one case which I was fascinated by, wanting to develop on, which is the case of Freddie Gray. So Freddie Gray was killed I believe he was killed by the police before he was put in the police car. And what they said is there was one witness who was divided by a wooden panel to the other side, and I think we have to finish. And he basically said that he heard loud banging, and the people in defense of the police officers said loud banging mean he killed himself, right? But of course, loud banging to someone who's interested in sound is not a description of sound. It's a description. It's the name of an entire language, right? Loud banging is the name of an entire language. And speak into the mic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is, in that case, there's a very specific thing I would want to do with it. I want to return to that guy who said he heard loud banging, and I would want to understand exactly what kind of loud banging he heard, right? Because another case could be that loud banging is just him banging his loose body, right? He's unconscious, whatever. So we need to understand more in depth to give a certain language that would be part of a kind of truth production. But by the same processes, you have to also be open to the ways in which, the more strange ways in which leakage happen. Not just through the car, the compartment of a car, but also, again, through the sort of memory and the ways in which those distortions can also give extremely lucid accounts, like the bread being heard as the door, right? Those slippages between objects can give even more lucid accounts about not necessarily the before and after, but about the event itself, and what it was like to hear or live an event specifically. So I think I have to be always open with these forms of investigation to kind of hear not only sound as a physical capacity or as an amplitude or as a set of frequencies, but also the ways in which it's internalized, it's given language, it's tethered to objects, and that's what I'm trying to deal with.
I think we should also open it to the public, and this is also an encouragement for our guests as well to speak with each other and to, so let's open it collectively and mutually. And of course the reminder to the participants to our workshops that they need to ask questions.
Thank you. I have a question for Marian, but if anyone wants to pick it up. Talking about inventory, I thought it was really interesting the last thing you said yesterday about a collection that had eliminated the notion of institutional propriety.
Sorry.
Yesterday you mentioned something about a collection that had that didn't have any propriety.
No, actually the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
And I thought that was a wonderful way of queering a collection that actually contests the collection as a colonial and modern device itself, and not only its narratives. And I think that's maybe at the heart of the problem here that we've been talking about, contesting or queering the institution and the collection itself. And I was wondering if through your very extensive work with inventories and collections through the years, you have given this any more thoughts, ways in which we can contest the device itself and not only its narratives.
Well, thank you. I'm a little embarrassed at having the mic again, but yes, that's a very exciting question for me. So, sorry. Queering the institution itself. Yes, ownership is at the heart of what we're talking about. We have skills. We try to get skills, gain skills, but at the bottom of everything is who owns what. Who has the power to erase? Who has the power to inscribe? These are all power relationships, and if the relationship is asymmetrical and violent, such as the relationship between a museum and, let's say, an Aboriginal society, then the idea that the materials produced and created by this society the ownership does not pass into an institution as big as a museum. Now that seems to me a rather interesting queering trajectory. The other thing that that's been on my mind is that the accession record itself. I did try for about a year to revise, to create an entirely new program for accession recording based on what I understood to be the material. And a lot of the material that I was handling in the Philippines, especially for this museum that I was trying to put up, where the things actually did not have nominal categories. They were not nouns. Of course, it took me about 20 years to realize that this textile is not called by a name. It was called by a verb. And so I tried to create for 1 year a program of accessioning that changed the hierarchy of the data fields, and putting up process of creation on top of naming, on top of because once an object passes into becoming an object, then that opens it to market, that opens it to everything. It becomes definitely the object. I did try to hinge an entire accession program from scratch on verbs. It did not work. I failed. But most of my curatorial projects are failures. It doesn't mean that you stop. But yes, there are very exciting things to try, and there are incredible failures. So that's the second thing. I guess the third thing that might be considered queering is the collapse of the museum itself. I mean, that has been heralded for a long time. You've got a whole 50 years of people, all the way to Douglas Crimp. But the collapse of the museum does not have to be in Douglas Crimp's ruins frame. I think that I can leave everyone here and they would have different ideas of how to collapse a museum.
May I just remind the audience, that the concept of queering the museum was brought in Bonaventure's script. Yeah.
Yeah, but I just like reflect to my experience in Netherlands. And within the Netherlands context, it's actually before we querying the institution, I actually asking about the accessibilities to the museum, because this is something that I cannot access, something that the institution, it's like the building that somebody cannot access. Like how, because this is like in the case of Europalia, like we have privilege, let's say, to access the museum, to talk with the director or to talk with the people who work in the museum, and to access the collection, to really touch the objects, but also to questioning the narration. So this is something that I want to engage with by critically engage with the institution, because I see now, like in my last experience is like, I'm asking about the accessibilities to really enter the building. Like, because like the museum, it's like, still it's the building. Close and cold.
Yeah, I mean, querying the museum, Vivian. Please.
May I? Please, yes, as much as possible. More queers in the museum, generally, literally.
Thank you for that one.
Yes. Two further examples, I guess, given that we're moving in that way. One to pick up on, I guess, what was the crux of what I was trying to introduce in my paper, which was a very basic argument about what is the nature of an exchange, and that the nature of exchange, in fact, is not merely a transfer of an item of property from one to another, but that exchange is in itself a form of production. It produces many immaterial effects and material effects eventually. So Australia has been engaged in one of the largest material restitution projects that there has been, which has been the, by now, largely failed project of land rights. And there's a case that the Indigenous scholar Aileen Morton Robertson tells as a way of trying to explain the stakes of that exchange. So she literally recites back the argument of a liberal critic from about the year 2000, Keith Windshuttle, whose argument was that because Indigenous people didn't have a notion of property as it's recognised within the European legal system, and because they didn't have a notion of land as alienable and ownable property as it's recognised within the European legal system, then they could not have been dispossessed because they didn't have the notion of property before Europeans arrived. So I highlight this to indicate what is really at stake within the process of acquiring of objects into a museum, and an entire notion of what the possible exchange is, and even more so to imply what is at stake if the object then leaves the museum. Often I've observed in Australia and in New Zealand there's a desire, and in Europe there's a desire to sort of be done with the problem. Just give it back and be done with it. Somehow that can be put right. But the exchange requires a number of set of processes that radically exceed merely the process of a transaction. There's a museum in the Netherlands, I believe in Leiden, that had Indigenous remains of Maori people, and who engaged in a long process by which there were meetings and exchanges, and it was decided together that the community whose remains this museum had did not want a severed relationship with the museum. They wanted a continued condition of obligation. And so they, in fact, received the remains back, but gave a canoe, a ritual canoe, and there's now an annual festival that happens around that canoe. There's an annual hosting of people from the Netherlands within families, Maori families in museum, that does the return of materials justice.
I would just like, because we're like in this particular line of thoughts of, well, queering the museum, which Bonaventure brought, well, with the voice of José Esteban Muñoz, but also because Bonaventure's intervention was very specific, I would like to provoke him a little bit to speak on this subject, particularly because of the incredible work that they're doing at Savi, and since Savi wasn't really like brought up as such, I would like to a little bit to provoke Bonaventure in this direction.
I mean, I really like the example you gave of the kind of relations that can be built then upon the idea of a return, not meaning it's a seizure, that everything ends, but that the relationship comes from that. And many a time I have told even politicians in Berlin that some people just want to be taken seriously. And that the mere fact that one acknowledges their propriety towards something is already something. It's already a gesture that you might end up even having to hear from them that keep it for a while, or we get into exchange, we communicate. So now, I was in Brazil last week, or a week and a half ago, and I heard an interesting story from Paulo Heckenhoff, who had been working with an indigenous community in Brazil, and they had proposed, actually, something similar. Give that back to us, and we give you something else, because we're actually interested in being in the museum. But we have the right to choose what is in there. So it is a shift in the relation, in that kind of in that position where there is a power gradient, because you have something that belongs to me in there. I didn't give it to you. I didn't choose the way it is displayed and how it is presented, you know. So now this brings me back to the reason why I wrote this in any case, you know, because we've experienced, in my case, being based in Germany for the past 20 years, conversations around these issues where always legal arguments are being made. So you didn't have a concept or legal idea of property, therefore it wasn't yours. Or the idea of we came, we conquered, we took, so it is ours. So you keep on having this argument. So I thought the legal argument is so difficult. Either you completely redo the laws, or you have to find other arguments. So it was about placing or situating, you know, or creating a kind of epistemological framework within which some of the so-called objects were created, and also the kind of spiritual, you know, framework within which they were made, you know, as an argumentation, especially in the context of you know, the idea of the object, you know. So when they've been made object, are there possibilities of us together, one, finding new ways of presenting them or dealing with them as objects, or two, undoing the objecthood? So that is a question I'm throwing in there. So, but before one does that, one has to understand those processes of objectification of them, you know. So it was a different set of arguments I was trying to make. Then the other thing was the economic value that is around these discussions, you know. Because, I mean, it was a very particular day yesterday, because, you know, this document was finally handed. I just got it also in my mailbox, and I haven't read it because I was invited a couple of times by Bénédicte Savoy to be also in this conversation as to what to deal with, how to deal with this object, in the Collège de France. Now, it was a special day yesterday because this Felvin Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy finally made the suggestion to the French president that there is no reason to have them there. So, give them back. Now, of course, that is a very complicated thing to do, but at least it is a renegotiation of that platform of power, and I think that is where we have to start, So I think that was just all I was trying to yes.
First of all, I wanted to really commend you because I was really moved yesterday by the work. And what I really liked, this discussion about the subject and the object, and also this spiritual nature of some of the work. And if I want to now bring it back to my work at the festival because it actually almost directly links. A lot of the material that I showed here on the screen was chosen very specifically because of its spiritual qualities, transcend, even if it was from Poland, whether it was from Indonesia, whether it was really charged with a spiritual quality and a transcendental quality, plus it was ephemeral and economically meaningless. So it linked in both ways to that. And that spirit, you see, that's where I was saying that it's not so interesting to think about the institution and the people and the person, but actually the spirit within the project, almost in the same way. And the other thing I was thinking about was, I think what James Baldwin also said, is that what was worse about slavery was the denial of the slavery, which might link to these conversations. Is that once you witness it, once you're able to call it what it is, call it out and witness it and acknowledge it, a huge step has been taken forward in terms of reconciliation both ways, I think even for the victim. And I think it's that denial of it being even almost worse than the perpetration of it in the first place.
Can I just give an example quickly? And Theo wants to certainly do, but anyway, I think there's lots of us who want to now speak. I just wanted to give another example of a project which is actually about where the works are located, where the works are in the inventory. This is just something I wanted to throw in. So in this big project, Hello World, at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, where I was only one of many curators, I was invited in to look at a collection of Indian modernism, primarily paintings, with the list of works being in the Ethnological Museum in Dahlem. And there was obviously a sort of hesitation to be that sort of agent without having the full license to actually really question what the future of this is. I mean, this is where one feels very personally stuck, because what you're doing within this kind of mainstream museum in the middle of Berlin is to temporarily bring out those objects, also often name those objects and their context, which is entirely missing. And what I partly managed to do, so part, I guess, failure, because those will probably go right back. Everybody's now even more excited to have them in the ethnological shelf, because you give them value and a story, right? But temporarily, what one could do was to charge that display with certain missing episodes. And those were to do with the partition. Those were to do with a figure like Tagore, who actually ended up donating a work to the museum, and then got destroyed within the Nazi cleansing agenda. So it was about recirculating, rethinking, and perhaps another generation, in this case, might be able to shake things up even more. But I think those of us who also choose to be sort of bilocated, partly in Europe, one foot, this is definitely an agenda. So whether it's those empty walls in the kind of Iranian case, or whether when there is a show, how to actually use those works and recharge them, that's maybe one job.
I was just thinking about riots and this museum discussion, thinking like in Latin America you have all this tradition of indigenism, right, in modern art through old 20th century. But also I have the feeling that if you think about indigeneity, like the struggle has been always against the officialism and the state, or like global extractivism in a way, right? So, and then if you trace like the big political struggles in the 20th century, either they are leftist, like orthodox Marxism, or far-right dictatorships, right? And we were just talking with Mariana about Chile and Nicaragua and so on. So the thing with indigenous communities at the end is that you can trace that the relation to the West in terms of political thinking is anarchism in many ways. And anarchism is like the huge phantom of political theory. So, and anarchism has been always the gesture and the political struggle by taking distance from the state. So how you rethink the museum institution by taking distance from officialism and from the state, right? That's kind of the challenge, I guess. And then if you look, for instance, Mexico, all the tradition with Zapatismo and autonomy is a struggle related to anarchism, but also if you look to Argentina, all the immigration from Italy, Enrico Malatesta, Brazil, and so on. So there are kind of political lines of thought and of activism and of riots and of practice related to indigenous communities that are not being rescued and discussed in the museum institution, right? So when you think about indigeneity and museum institution, there is always this kind of inclusion, which is not enough at all, right? So yeah, it's about indigeneity and not necessarily just about the indigenous subject, right? So yeah.
Are there more? Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I think that's a good point for me to ask my question and to pivot into something a little more practical. I'm from Taiwan, and there are issues about repatriation within the indigenous community there as well. The ethnographic museums that have inherited a lot of stuff from the colonial period have this notion to repatriate remains and artifacts back to the Ami tribe. But oftentimes this is inhibited by the conditions that these artifacts need to be maintained in the same way that the museum would conserve them and maintain them or exhibit them. And since we're talking about heritage and sort of violence and these issues of histories, I was wondering if, and this is not to anyone in particular, but if someone could respond to the idea that these communities have the right to allow these artifacts to perhaps disappear from the discourse, or to have their exhibition history sort of cut short in that way. Just a general response to that, yeah.
Okay, if I'm...
Okay. I've got a very quick story about that. And it relates to the claim, so within, let's say, the last sort of 100 years of struggle in Australia, there have been a number of sort of efforts to articulate things that cannot appear within the modern episteme. And so one of the first efforts was land rights made by Indigenous people, and then that played out through a legal system, and it was clear that it was possible for that to be framed in a way that didn't mean what Indigenous people meant, which was full entitlement to the enjoyment of land in a certain way that doesn't exist within the European legal system. One of the second attempts was to state sovereignty. So again, that's not sovereignty in the way that it's meant within the European international legal system, but what sovereignty means is that you don't come in here and you don't need to know what's in here, right? I was thinking very much during the program yesterday that there was an encounter that I had that's been helpful in thinking this through when I was invited to do the Jerusalem show in 2016. Coming immediately from Australia and then moving to this Palestinian context, I was invited to then work on the notion of return, which is one of the most challenging notions that there is and that I was ill-equipped to deal with. So I traveled extensively and I was up in some villages in Julan in the Golan Heights, which are in fact Syrian villages, and there's 5 of them that still stand, whereas about 100 villages, Palestinian villages surrounding it, don't stand anymore. And I was taking a bus back down to Haifa with a young man from Majd al-Shams, and we were chatting, and I'd been trying to understand the right of return. And I asked him, does right of return mean something to you? And he said, yes, absolutely. And I was like, well, okay, could you please explain more, because you're Syrian and then you're still in the village, so what does return mean to you? And he said to me, you don't worry about the return, you worry about the right. And I think we saw that difficulty. I mean, it's a pity that he's not here to explain and defend more, but I think we saw that problem with the position from a French institution where there's the beginning of a process of repatriation that hasn't even begun, and yet the entire discourse that was offered to us was one of questioning where it should end, And I think the same thing applies, like please institutions, don't worry about where this ends and about where it needs to be controlled. Please let's worry about starting it in good faith as a transformative project.
If I may, because it's a very important question, I will answer also with an anecdote or just a story. So, I am in a village in Cameroon speaking to my grandfather, who at the time was 98 or something. And I'm telling him about this so-called brilliant seminal film that was done by Alain Resnais and Chris Marker, Les Statues Meurent aussi. I'm telling him it's okay, that when they put in these institutions, they kind of die and so on. And the guy looks at me and says, no, I disagree with you. And I'm stunned. And he says, actually, no, keeping them in the museum is a possibility of making them immortal. Not mortal, but immortal. Because as beings, some of them actually do have the right to die. So now, a lot of the arguments that have been given, why not to, I will talk about the concept of the return in a bit, not to send them back, not to return, not to repatriate, is that there are not adequate institutions to take care of them. Now, so that is, to me, an incredible infantilization that is going on, an insult to the people, first of all, that know how to keep what they made, one, and two, that you take away the right, even for some of those so-called objects, to die, if they had to die. So I think it's a very complicated conversation. That is why I wanted to give this anecdote. Now, we're working with an artist from the Sami land for the Finland pavilion in Venice next year. And we're talking about the concept, and she tells me, no, but I want you to know, I don't want to think about repatriation. And she says, I want to think about rematriation. And I think it's just one of these fancy words that come in. She says, no, because the concept of the Sami people, as she says, is based on the matri, not the patrie. So let's think about that. Another thing is that the patrie also comes with a set of legal, structures which have to be dismantled. So again, the concept of repatriation becomes very difficult, or even the return, because nothing stays still, so you can hardly return. Now, what I've been trying to do in my writing in the past years is also to propose the idea of a rehabilitation, which is to say, in this case, we're going to create a completely new structure, all of us, the people that, that have this in their museums today, the people that claim to be the people of origin, and so on and so on. We have to create a new structure to habilitate, to give them, spaces. So it's a matter of creating new spaces that don't necessarily have to be the pre-colonial and so on and so forth, but that create spaces where they will be in. And that is also part of the querying of what the museum could possibly be. So where it is not about integrating the so-called indigenous within a museum structure, but reimagining what a museum could be. Because a museum, as the concept exists everywhere. That's why yesterday we were trying to propose, say, this is the primary museum. A kind of a provocation, but this is it. Then we get into encounter other structures that we call museums. So finding new spaces or reimagining some of those old ones and giving these beings spaces. Sorry, it took too long.
I think I just want to I guess I'll just be reiterating what Vivian and Bonaventure said, but one of the main preoccupations of the work I've done is, I guess, this idea of resolution. And resolution not as a kind of coming to an end or coming to anything definitive, but actually resolution as a better way of seeing. And I think that and then that's when the interest in structures, in spiritualities, in various kind of networks that kind of allow a thing to live become important. And also as visual people, seeing resolution in that sense, we then occupy a position of power. So yeah, it's sort of that.
The very last question, and it will have to be answered only by one person.
Okay, so I'm gonna use Natasha and wait.
We had a deal here.
wait. Yeah. No, hold on. So I'm gonna use Natasha's presentation and also.
I think we stick with Natasha.
And Bonaventure's presentations as entry points to my question. So Natasha, in your presentation, you brought up Ta-Nehisi's text, Between the World and Me, which is about an African man writing a letter to his son about what it is like to inhabit the body of the other, which in this case is the black body in the American context. And Bonaventure touched on the limits of museum, which reads violence and history through objects and secondary sources, but it seems like this collapse of museum that you're suggesting is sort of offered through the self-narration of violence through bodies who have been direct recipients of violence or whose bodies are themselves produced with the legacy of violences. So my question is that when we talk and exhibit violence and stories and narratives of violence, how do curators thread on this carefully? And I suppose this is an ethical question, so as not to avoid repeating sort of the ways that anthropologists fetishize violence and the way they sort of read the bodies of the other. So that's my question. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I do believe that working with artists who at times are witnesses, at times are I started working with Lawrence very early on as just one example, and this whole idea of producing evidence, in Pio's case as well, or testimony, these are ways of taking responsibility. These are ways of animating one's position between the body and the world. And I also do work with certain anthropologists very selectively, people like Elizabeth Povinelli, who basically became an anthropologist. I'm just telling this because it's just, I think it would break with, the kind of antagonism we have when confronting the anthropological narrative, but who became an anthropologist after years of meeting a community and realizing that the need that they have is to have an anthropologist in their sort of clan, in their family, in their extended family, in order to protect them and defend them before the state. So I just, if obviously you understand that as a curator, I mean, it's not simply about kind of artificial knowledge production and sort of becoming a sort of expert giving sound bites, but it is in fact about carrying the burden of what artistic truth, maybe to use a heavy word, might also come to mean in our common reality.
I also think it's a very good question. I know only one person was supposed to answer, but just permit me to say two things. One is, you know, I think of course it's a fine line between dealing with violence, working with it, and fetishizing it. Of course it's a fine line. But I think that one must permit the possibility of dealing with it as catharsis, or to create catharsis, to be able to deal with it, to be able to restart. I think that is one very important thing. So one must face, you know, sometimes the dragon in the eye. One possibility. The other possibility, which is, again, you know, the piece by Glenn Ligon that Natasha showed, you know, the comments on the cover of from the cover of the book Black Rage, which is an important book, which was written, you know, also by two African Americans, you know, thinking about that concept, you know, and it is also, you know, the violence happens in so many different ways. It's also about the inscription of violence on you. Now, so dealing with that becomes very important. You know, there's a paper by Bell Hooks called Killing Rage, where she describes, you know, like a day in her life in New York, you know, and the way she deals with that rage. So I think there's that possibility of facing that for catharsis. The second thing is, once one faces that, one can imagine, or one can at least try to propose, you know, other trajectories to take. So I think today I was very happy about, you know, the sonic that came out, you know, possibilities of imagining the world through that sonic space. And I think, you know, it is not about just putting a spotlight on the violence, but also imagine and creating other spaces of reflections and where we will find ourselves, where we will find our knowledges, and so on and so forth, you know. So it is never meant to be an end, but the opening of multiple trajectories.
Wait, yeah. Just to say thank you to Cosmin and Inti, because this was amazing. I can't remember a better conference, really, I can't. So thank you so much, it was great.
Oh. Thank you. Well, I think we need to let this go. And yeah, a huge thank you to all of you for coming all the way to us and engaging so passionately and brilliantly with each other, with us, with the audience, and with the subject. And a big thank you to well, the participants, to our workshop, our guests from the Apple, and to the audience. And a big thank you to our team at Parasite, and especially to Celia Ho. And can we please, please, please give a big applause? And also to Alan from Daikun. And also because I didn't like to YJ, our designer, for playing so beautifully with Pio's work. And thank you all. And thank you all. And yeah, we're just going to do a group photo. So yeah, so also the participants and Hira and Özge and yeah, well, everyone, please come on stage and we're gonna do a quick photo and then we're gonna go and eat.